So today, I speak, of course, in the name of Eilert Heine, but I'm extremely happy to introduce Cécile Laborde and our two discussants, Martijn van den Brink and Eva Buderberg. So Cécile Laborde is a professor at the University of Oxford. She holds the Nuffield Chair of Political Theory and is the fellow of the British Academy. And before joining Oxford, she was a professor at UCL. Lecturer at King's College London and the University of Exeter. She was the founding director of the UCL's famous Religion and Political Theory Centre. Cécile Laborde is very famous, for political theorists, at least famous. I call fame, for me it's
I'm going to popular culture, so I can sing if you like.
Well, why not? We'll see. After lunch it's always difficult to engage everyone. So
start a new career. Yeah.
Exactly. So Cécile Laborde is famous for her work on republicanism, liberalism and religion, theories of laws and of law and global justice. Her books have all been heavily influential, framing some of the most important debates in recent political theory, and I think, of course, among others, of liberalism, religion in 2017, and critical republicanism, the hijab controversy, and political philosophy in 2008. Of course, she published numerous book chapters. She co-edited several books that also have gathered very influential scholars: religion, liberal political philosophy, religion, secularism, and constitutional democracy, and so on. Numerous papers. I will not start dwelling on those, and I just wanted to finally mention that she did not forget France by taking part in some important public debates regarding her field of expertise. So it's never easy to express in the French debates political nuances and subtleties that political theory can teach us. And she actually did it with an extraordinary lucid voice, trying to warn the French that an open meaning of republicanism was possible in her book Français, encore un effort pour devenir républicain. And she tried to warn against binary and identitarian thought on laïcité or the veil. Needless to say, that's still a work in progress to convince everyone about this. But today she'll address the topic of liberal nationalism and symbolic religious establishment, which is, I think, book chapter that will soon be published. I suggest that I introduce the discussants once they speak. All right? The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Benjamin, for this very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank my hosts, Heine and Eilert. I always love coming to Frankfurt. I always find I learn a lot from you all. So, and I'm sure we learned a lot today, because this is just an offshoot from my book. It's not something I've given enough thought to. So I'm really keen to hear responses and suggestions as to how to take it further. This is I've co-authored this with Suni Legard, and it's the chapter tried to assess the ethical justifiability of what we call symbolic religious establishment, and it's quite an applied paper. We drew on some sociological literature, and it's not something I've done a lot in the past, so I'm really, as I said, I'm very keen to learn from you. I will only speak for 25 minutes or so. Okay, so the context for this chapter is a number of heated debates that have erupted in the public spheres of European, and I will focus on Western European liberal democracies, about the place of majority religions in the public sphere. So the contested practices have in mind range from the display of crucifixes in Italian schools and German public buildings, the preservation of the Christian character of the national landscape through a ban on Islamic minarets in Switzerland, through to the continued ceremonial role of the Church of England in British public life. So these are instances of what I call in my book symbolic religious establishment. So they connote practices that Brubaker's called Christianist secularism, whereby the symbols of a traditional culturalized Christianity are mobilized to underpin a sense of collective identity and social cohesion, as well as an affirmation of liberal Western values at a time of popular anxiety about globalization, migration, and cultural dislocation. So the question I want to ask is, how compatible with liberal values are such practices? So I think there are two kind of preliminary responses in the literature. This is not, to my knowledge anyway, not many people have worked on this. So to critics, any form of religious establishment, even symbolic, is straightforwardly incompatible with the principles of separation of state and religion and liberal neutrality. That's the critics' view. To its defenders, such practices can be an acceptable mode of liberal nationalism. Why? Because those religious markers are in fact benign cultural symbols which can be harnessed to the promotion of a thin sense of national identity. Right, so these are the two poles of the debate as far as I can see, and I don't like either of them. But I want to say that the disputes over symbolic religious establishment raise difficult questions then about the relationship between liberal nationalism and secularism, and the relationship between culture and religion. And I want to suggest that settling those disputes will involve a more sophisticated analysis of these concepts and of the communicative meaning of various symbols than more complex than participants in the debate so far have deployed. So basically what I want to say is that while it is true that symbolic establishment mobilizes culture rather than religion, and these are in all inverted commas, I aim to argue that this doesn't make it more inclusive, because culture can be as exclusive as religion. So I want to do the burden of my arguments to show when that's the case. Okay, so let me start with liberal nationalism. So defenders of liberal nationalism, such as David Miller or Will Kymlicka, argue that the state can recognize some aspect of culture. So it can be some thin version of national identity or a widely shared societal culture, a la Kymlicka. So they think that's fine, but they also think that whilst it's okay for a state to support a culture, it's never okay for a state to promote a religion. Right? And Kymlicka is very clear in working with this idea that culture and religion are essentially disanalogous. It's not so clear to me why this would be the case. So we need to say more about what is it about religion that make it true that it should not be endorsed by the state, right? So what is it about religious markers? What is it about religion that makes its endorsement by the state impermissible by liberal standards? So why this disanalogy between culture and religion in liberal thought? That's the starting point. So to answer the question, I draw on some material from my last book, which Benjamin was kind enough to mention. So in liberalism, religion, I try to understand the sense in which religious establishment is problematic when it is. So I argue that official endorsement of religion by the state is problematic for liberal legitimacy because of three features that are typically but not necessarily associated with religion. So I briefly mentioned them. The first is what you might call the fact that religious beliefs are not part of public reason. something about the inaccessibility of certain religious commitments, such that state officials should not appeal to the truth of religious doctrines to justify their laws and policies, because this would compromise the idea of democratic justification. Right? We have something about public accessibility and democratic justification. The second reason is the fact that religious conceptions of the good are comprehensive. Right? So the comprehensive scope of religious conceptions of the good make it the case that the state should not coercively impose one religious way of life onto its citizens because of the scope of religion that would compromise their personal liberty. Right? So that's kind of liberty-based reason. First one is a kind of public reason-based, second one is a liberty-based, and the third one is an equality-based reason. And this is the fact that very often religious identity is divisive, socially divisive, such that the state should not endorse one identity when this would undermine the equal civic status of non-members of the recognized identity, so to say. So what I do in the book is to kind of disaggregate this concept of religion into the salient dimensions of religion and show that state promotion of religion is only problematic when religion shares one of those dimensions, if you see what I mean. So I think this disaggregation of the concept of religion has a number of advantages that are relevant to my talk today. So the first one is, well, I think it explains why liberals such as Kymlicka have deemed state endorsement of religion to be incompatible with liberalism, because very often religion is inaccessible, comprehensive, and divisive. Therefore, most instances of religious establishment, including what Ran Hirsch has called constitutional theocracies, are indeed illiberal because they infringe on public justification, personal liberty, and equal status. Right? So we can explain what's wrong with religious establishment. Second, the disaggregation approach explains why religion, but not only religion, is problematic from the point of view of liberal legitimacy. Right? So some secular philosophies, cultures, and ideologies can exhibit exactly those features that make religion unsuitable for state endorsement. So one interpretation of French laïcité, rooted in a comprehensive, secularist and individualistic worldview, considers Islamic veiling, for example, to be incompatible with national identity. So we have a comprehensive secularism that is contestable on exactly the same ground as forms of religious establishment. Right? Third, the disaggregation approach explains why religion is not always unsuitable for state endorsement if and when it is not inaccessible, comprehensive, or divisive. So that's where this opens a space for some forms of recognition of religion by the state. Right? So in those cases, official recognition of the majority religion by the state is permissible. Right? So that's the kind of theoretical framework I'm working with. Right? So I hope, I don't have much time to develop it, but that gives us a kind of handle on the kinds of principles that are relevant if we are going to assess the legitimacy of practices of symbolic religious establishment, with which I open the talk. So let's think about symbolic. I'm going to say SRE just to avoid the mouthful, but SRE is symbolic religious establishment. So evidently, SRE violates neither the accessibility nor the non-comprehensiveness requirement. Right? Usually, SRE is justified not by appeal to the inherent truth of Christianity, but by appeal to its historical and cultural resonance and the role it can play in sustaining a sense of national continuity and social cohesion. So usually it can be justified in public reason. Likewise, the tenets of Christian comprehensive doctrines are not coercively imposed through the law. Nobody is forced to practice Christianity under SRE, right? So members of religious minorities are free to practice their own religion without hindrance. So that's the sense in which religious establishment is merely symbolic. That's what I mean by symbolic. It doesn't infringe any religious rights, okay? So if SRE affronts liberalism, then it is going to be by virtue of the third requirement, the equality requirement, that of non-divisiveness. So I want to concentrate on this. I want to concentrate on the question of whether SRE infringes the civic inclusion or equality requirement. So to do this, well, I basically try to make a case for SRE, and then I show why it doesn't work. So what's the case for SRE? So here again, I'm focusing on SRE in Europe. So I think those debates about SRE have really arisen in relation to what we might call the European religious model of governance. Or the European model of governance of religion. I think it's the best way of finding. So throughout Europe, historically dominant churches, even those churches that have not been officially disestablished, that has to be wrong. Historically dominant churches, even churches that have been officially established, continue to exert significant continual influence, right? So whether they're established or disestablished, I think in Europe it is true to say that the historically dominant church still has social influence. So national churches perform social functions such as weddings and funerals, and they host significant national and community events. So when we think of the American model treats churches plural as voluntary associations, I think Europeans tend to perceive the church kind of singular as a traditional state-supported institution whose membership comprises society as a whole. I think that's a fairly common model in many European countries. And consequently, I think many European states exhibit institutions of what I call elsewhere modest establishment. So including formal links between the church and state institutions, public funding of church-based welfare functions, the raising of church taxes, in Germany, for example, subsidies for church schools, and Christian ritual ceremonies in public places. So clearly there are lots of different dimensions to this modest establishment, but I only want to concentrate on its symbolic dimension. So I won't look at the distributive implications of tax, and I won't look at education. I just really want to concentrate on those cases that don't seem to raise issues about distribution, for example, or coercion, or the distribution of public goods, right? And I also want to take a broad view of SRE, so I want to refer not only to those practices that are associated with formally established churches, as in England or Denmark, but also practices that do not depend on formal establishment, but involve the official recognition of the majority religion by public authorities, as in Italy or Germany. So arguably, it is at the intersection of those practices that liberal nationalism meets religion, right? Where state-promoted national identity deliberately incorporates religious markers. So what are the arguments in favor of SRE as I've just described it? In particular, in what sense is it compatible with civic inclusion? Three arguments. In the I mean, there's not much literature on this, but as far as I can tell, it's got three main arguments. First argument is, well, look, in practice, SRE does not alienate religious minorities. Right? There's one empirical study. There's not much empirical work, but there is one empirical study by Jonathan Cox and colleagues that suggests that state support for one religion is not correlated with lesser confidence by minorities in their state institution. There is no correlation there. Authors such as sociologists such as Tariq Moudud in the British context has gone further and suggested that establishment in practice makes religious minorities feel more welcome in society because it might signal a general acceptance of religion and might function as a bulwark against the pervasive secularization of Western societies. Right? So that's a kind of an argument that in practice minorities don't seem to mind it. Right? First argument. Second argument says that SRE is actually liberal in content. And here there's a story to be told about European Christianity as itself kind of liberalized, and in recent decades it's been a powerful driver of values of tolerance, equality and inclusiveness, particularly after he made peace with the secular state and the values underlying separation between church and state. And so on this view, Christian signs are only the kind of benign symbols of the moderate liberal values of Western democratic states. So you find this kind of reasoning in judicial decisions, such as the famous or notorious one, the Lauzi decision in Italy, where the Consiglio di Stato affirmed that the crucifix represents civic values, such as tolerance and freedom of conscience, which happen to have a Christian origin. So Christian symbols are not religious markers here, but markers of freedom and secularism, according to the court. They're not sectarian, but inclusive in their message and appeal, and that draws on Christianity's own ecumenical ambitions. The third argument in support of SRE is that what is established and endorsed by the state is a non-theological, culturalized Christianity. Right? One that does not require creedal assent, but merely a quiescent socialization. So it is inclusive of minorities for that reason. So you find this in the Bavarian Higher Administrative Court decision on the crucifixes in public spaces, where it was claimed, and I quote, "The mere presence of the representation of the cross demands neither an identification with the ideas or belief thereby embodied, nor any form of active behavior orientated thereto." End of quote. So this points really to the broadly cultural dimension of religion. And this, especially in Europe, have been extensively studied by sociologists. As I said, I'm really not an expert in their literature, but the two concepts that I found really interesting in understanding cultural religion. One of them is the concept of belonging without believing. So many Europeans, even if they do not practice any active form of religion, they don't go to church, for example, regularly, a large number of Europeans still continue to maintain formal affiliation with the traditional churches, which they see as part of what it means to be a member of a national community. They will still have Christian funerals, for example, even if they don't identify with the tenets of the Christian faith, but very few people opt for secular funerals. Right? So there's kind of a cultural role played by churches, particularly in Europe. Many think that festivities such as Christmas have lost their religious meaning for many people, but they still constitute moments when the community kind of comes together. And the thought is you don't need to believe in a Christian God or in the divinity of Jesus to partake in Christmas celebrations, from tree decoration to carol singing, which has become a very secular activity that people engage in. I don't know, well, I guess it's the same here, but certainly in England. So culturalized Christianity then appears to be inclusive, both of non-believers and of minorities, because it does not require theological conformity. It really doesn't require you to believe in anything. You can join the choir for Christmas. Okay, so that's the argument as far as I can see. I mean, SRE does not affront the idea of equal inclusion because it doesn't alienate religious minorities. It's liberal in content, and its communicative meaning is purely cultural. So in the rest of my time, I would just want to cast a few doubts on this view, and I want to argue that, so I don't want to dispute those facts, right? So I want to argue that even in cases when SRE is non-alienating, liberal and culturalized, I don't think that's sufficient to demonstrate it is legitimate. Right? So I still want to, I don't want to deny, you know, we can always find counterexamples and show that nothing that I've described is actually true. I just want to assume that it is true. And I want to say that even if that's the case, it doesn't justify it. So again, I have three arguments which really are rejoinders to the previous three. So on the first point, on the alienation point, I really don't think, and we discussed this with Catherine over lunch, but I really don't think that alienation is sufficient ever as a metric for the legitimacy of laws and institutions, and likewise for non-alienation or reconciliation. So the problem with that view is that how citizens in fact interpret establishment gives a descriptive answer to a normative question about when it is reasonable to view establishment as sending a message of inclusion and exclusion. So we need to say more in order to establish the communicative meaning of public celebrations and symbols in ways that are not reducible to the way in which they are in fact perceived by citizens. So we need to say a bit more, and what I try to say, again, I haven't fully developed the idea in the book, I try to do a bit more here, but so the thought is that SRE is wrong because of its communicative meaning when, and only when, this aggravates the social vulnerability of minorities. So that would be the condition under which it is problematic normatively. But so there's a lot to unpack in that definition, so we need to articulate a more precise definition of which groups are relevant minorities as measured by objective criteria of collective vulnerability in particular societies. And then we need to be more sensitive to the complexity of the project of specifying what a symbol means, what's the communicative meaning of symbols, and for whom. Right? So we have a whole complex process of the interrogating the semiotics of culture, which is inevitably context dependent, but also has to be sensitive to the kind of temporality of minorization. And I'll say something about that particular point in closing. So let me just to illustrate the importance of asking the question, who's a minority in this context, right? Consider the following example. Imagine most atheists in England are alienated by the symbolic rituals associated with Anglican establishment. So they think it's completely archaic, unrepresentative, and offensive to their convictions. Is this a politically problematic alienation? I don't think so. Why? Because I think atheists are not a socially vulnerable group in English society, and they're not vulnerable to discrimination qua atheists. So the mere fact that there is a symbolic establishment is not enough to show that they're discriminated. So my theory, just the presence of establishment is not sufficient, is not in itself wrongly discriminatory. Right? For it to be wrongly discriminatory, it has to map onto an existing structure of discrimination. So SRE might be legitimate, and I don't take a position on that substantive example. I just want to illustrate the reasoning about identifying who a minority is. SRE might be legitimate in this case if it enjoys broad support among the population, as it is not objectively divisive and exclusive of atheists, even if it might displease or offend them. So in this case, it's really similar to state promotion of cultural activities, from the arts to particular sports, which does not infringe on the equal status of non-practitioners or non-adherents. They might dislike it, but that kind of dislike might not be anything to worry about. There's nothing unjust about it. And why? Because they're not minorities in the sense that matter to the equal inclusion requirement. By contrast, of course, Muslims and Jews, so sticking with the English example, are minorities, not simply in the sense that they are numerically less populated subset of the population, but rather because they are a social groups vulnerable to discrimination and neglect on ground of their religion. That's the difference with the atheists. Okay. How then should we interpret the fact, if it is a fact, that even vulnerable minorities such as Muslims do not generally object to or even resent SRE? I think here we must be careful in interpreting the evidence. So, as Tariq Modood, who's the author who's made that case most forcefully, even as he has emphasized, SRE might be a lesser evil arrangement for Muslims in British society, right? Of course, they probably would prefer, they do prefer a regime of modest establishment, such as England, rather than a regime of public secularism, which they imagine France to be. But it's still the case that between a regime of Anglican precedence and a regime of more equal recognition, where Muslims would also have recognition in the House of Lords and within schools, they probably would prefer the latter, right? So the non-alienation criterion has to be interpreted with care here. And I think as pluralism grows, I think it's doubtful that a regime of Anglican precedence will continue to convey a message of inclusiveness without substantial moves towards multi-faith establishment. So I think the egalitarian move would be something like multi-faith establishment. So perhaps okay to celebrate Christmas, but only as long as other religious festivals such as Eid or Hanukkah are recognized too. It would be something like that. But I think there is, sticking to Anglican establishment, and again, only focusing on its symbolic dimensions. There are non-symbolic dimensions as well, but just focusing on these symbolic dimensions, I think there is a further complication here. So, on my view, which doesn't single out religion as special, right? You'll have gathered that. So, on my view, the relevant minorities are not only religious minorities, right? So there are other relevant minorities. So consider gay couples in societies such as England, where same-sex marriages are granted the full status of marriages, right? So there is equality in that sense, but the established church, the Anglican Church, does not officiate them, right? So at the time of writing, at the time of speaking, the Anglican Church only offers blessings, but not full marriage to homosexual unions. So you have the situation where gay couples have full rights to marry, but this right is in effect symbolically denied by the established church. Right? The fact that it be denied by a church, I think, can be justifiable if it's a private church, but this is the official church of, it's an officially established church by the state. So I think this is quite problematic. So, and the paradox, of course, is that religious minorities, such as Muslims, might well welcome this symbolic assertion of the continuing value of the traditional family, right? But I think gay and lesbian citizens are objectively turned into second-class citizens, whether or not they feel alienated or not. They are objectively turned into second-class citizens when the national church, that's the church that's there to serve the whole citizenry, not simply the faithful, when that church officializes a distinction between genuine and non-genuine marriage. Right? So we have a kind of symbolic establishment of traditional marriage, and I think that really inscribes into the state a differentiated status between two classes of marriage, which perpetuates the social vulnerability of gays and lesbians. So I think a compelling argument in favor of disestablishment, I think, is actually not related to the attitudes of religious minorities towards vestigial Christian precedents. Rather, it's a growing gap between traditional religious norms of family and marriage and the inclusive recognition of gay and lesbian couples. Okay, so much for the alienation and who's entitled to feel alienated, etc. Secondly, I want to cast doubt on this idea that the cooptation of religious symbols for liberal ends is compatible with equal inclusion. Because it seems to me that when liberal values are expressed through religious symbols, the implicit message is that one religion, Christianity, has a privileged relationship or even a monopoly over those values. But then how are Muslims supposed to embrace liberalism if liberalism is thereby indigenized and particularized? Right? If appeal to liberalism serves to erect a boundary between those who belong and those who do not belong to liberalism, right? So here I think there's an interesting analogy with what commentators have called homo-nationalism. So the homo-nationalist movement in countries such as, well, I guess here, but also the Netherlands and Scandinavian countries. So homo-nationalism refers to the defense of equality between sexualities as a key component of national identity. Right? That's what the term refers to. So we are proudly European or any kind of national because we are pro-gay. That's homo-nationalism. So this transpired, for example, in the aftermath of the brutal homophobic murder of filmmaker Theo van Gogh, which was widely condemned in the Netherlands as an attack on Dutch values. Right? And connectedly, the degree of acceptance of homosexuality is now an explicit criterion in nationality tests for foreigners in many European countries. So no doubt this reflects an understandable anxiety about the rejection by radical Islamists of what they describe as Western values of gender and sexual equality. But still, homo-nationalism problematically, I think, conjures up an idealized mythical heritage of a gay-friendly Christian Western culture, which it contrasts with a homophobic Arabic and Muslim culture. And I think not only is this a grave historical distortion, but also just makes it very difficult for Muslim citizens in European countries, to come to embrace liberal values in matters of sex and sexuality. And it's also very difficult for them to articulate dissent, let alone alienation, because they end up being caught in a kind of double bind of cultural conformity and religious betrayal. So the thought here, I mean, I run the analogy with homo-nationalism to show that it's not sufficient for a collective identity to have liberal content for it to be inclusive in the relevant sense, right? And I think that connects to my third point, and third and last point. So really the move from religion to culture does not in itself render certain markers or symbols more acceptable by the standard of equal inclusion. Two reasons. First one is, who defines what's cultural and what's religion, right? So what counts as a merely cultural symbol is usually exclusively defined from the viewpoint of majorities, right? So perhaps secularized Christians in Italy and elsewhere would perceive the crucifix in school as a benign, inclusive symbol, but it's unclear why non-Christians, so Jews and Muslims, are likely to see it in the same way, right? And there's some very interesting work by Susanna Mancini on this. She's looked at the kind of double standard used in describing majority symbols and minority symbols in the European Court of Justice. Right? So the majority symbols are very often secularized. So the cross is not really religious. It's just benign culture. It's in the background. You don't really see it, right? But that's what a secularized Christian would say about it. They're used to seeing it. They don't see it in the same way because they don't believe in God anymore. So they see it as benign. But of course, in a minority, you might see the cross differently, right? And likewise, courts have had a tendency to culturalize majority symbols, but to over-religionize minority symbols. right? So the hijab becomes a symbol of all kinds of things, and it stands in for all kind of essentializations about Islam and the other, and anti-gender equality, etc. So that symbol suddenly it becomes an active symbol. It says a lot, whereas the cross is described as a passive symbol. But of course, what is a passive and what is an active symbol can't just be described from the viewpoint of majorities, I think, in a democracy. The second worry about culture, people say, well, it's a very thin culture. You know, all these symbols, it doesn't, you know, you can still live your life the way you want, it doesn't forces you to do much, it's very thin. The problem about thin identities, they can be very exclusive as well, right? You can do a lot with a thin identity if it's one that establishes boundaries. And it seems to me that most of the symbols, that's what they do. They're very thin, but the message they have is, we belong and you don't. So that's a pretty thick message that's conveyed through a thin identity, right? So there's a lot of work by sociologists about how symbolic boundary work is central to the construction of national identities, right? So I talked earlier about belonging without believing, but that doesn't necessarily denote a benignly tolerant vestigial attachment to age-old tradition, right? Feelings of what the French sociologist Daniel Hervieux-Léger has called ethnic religion, cultural. I call it cultural religion, but they've been reactivated, those feelings, mostly in the aftermath of 9/11 and fears around globalization and migration. So tellingly, there was a poll in Britain that saw the number of self-described Christians dramatically rise after 9/11. Suddenly, like the number of Christians in England had kind of quadrupled. Now, why is that? Clearly, this is an identitarian answer to the assertion of Islam, rather than the continued expression of traditional faith. Suddenly, people thought they wanted to be Christian because they wanted to show that they don't like Muslims, more or less. And so, cultural Christianity is really not more tolerant or inclusive than religious Christianity. I think that's a complete myth. And in fact, there is sociological evidence pointing out that people who define themselves as culturally Christian, they're more likely to harbor anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiments than their practicing religious counterparts. Because the religious Christians, they're more likely to see foreigners, immigrants, and refugees as brothers. Okay, so to conclude, I think I've been talking about age-old feelings versus reactivated feelings, and I think there's something to the kind of temporality of the normative assessment of different practices or symbolic establishment. So to conclude, I'd just like to suggest this distinction, which I think is crucial, but I've not quite developed the theory to explain why, so perhaps you can help me with that. But I think we should distinguish between vestigial establishment and neo-establishment. So vestigial establishment refers to the continuing presence in a range of institutions and practices of the symbols and rituals of the historically dominant religion. Right? Europe wouldn't be Europe without all the crosses that we can see in our public sphere, and all the Christian churches. They're part and parcel of our heritage, and I think it would be silly to say that these are problematically or wrongfully alienating, right? So most dimensions of vestigial establishment, I think, are benign, normatively. But I think things are different in case of neo-establishment. So what I mean by neo-establishment are situations where political institutions, political communities decide to restate and reaffirm and re-establish the public prominence of the historically dominant religion. Because then the question is why? Why do you do it? Why now? It's okay to just always to have had crosses, but you have to put a new one on, basically. So that's the question. So that's what I'm trying to get to with that distinction between vestigial and neo-establishment. So it's the same symbol, but who does it and why, and do we have to have new ones? I think is the question to ask. So consider, for example, the decision by the Bavarian parliament, according to which, so in consideration of the Bavarian historical and cultural connotation, a crucifix shall be displayed in all classrooms, on the ground that they are, and I quote, an essential object of the general Christian Occidental tradition and common property of the Christian Occidental cultural circle. But what you have here is a kind of reactive decision to install crucifixes in public institutions, and I think this is more salient, normatively speaking, than the case of the maintenance of, the Italian, the Lauzi case, simply maintaining crucifixes because they were there. Traditionally they were there. Right? So it's tricky to explain what is it about neo-establishment that's more problematic, but I think intuitively there's something to it, because this newly proud display of Christian symbols is really designed to send a distinctive message, and possibly a different message from that sent by the vestigial crosses, right? And the message really is, we define ourselves in opposition to what we are not. We are Christian, we are not Muslim. That's really what those neo signs are supposed to say. So I think they have a specifically exclusionary dimension. And this exclusionary dimension of new establishment, I think, can be diagnosed regardless of the stated intentions of policymakers and regardless of the subjective reactions of members of minorities. Although both these things can be indicators that something has gone wrong, but I don't think they are the wrong itself. So consider as an illustration of this point the Swiss decision to ban the building of Muslim minarets. So this was justified by some as the expression of a benign cultural heritage, right, which is concerned with the preservation of the historical landscape made of small villages and towns adorned with church towers and spires, right, and minarets would break with that. But in fact, if that's what it's about, the application of existing building regulations would have been completely sufficient to protect this vestigial form. If you care about the Christian allure of old Swiss villages, you can do that within existing building regulations. You don't need to have a referendum that say we're going to ban minarets. That's the difference between vestigial establishment and new establishment. So what having a referendum banning minarets, the message is sent is not we want to protect our vestigial culture or whatever. It's really that minarets were supposed to symbolize the outer boundary of the imagined community of Swiss citizens. Minarets and therefore Muslims are not really Swiss. So again, this is exclusive, I think, regardless of whether Muslims actually wanted minarets. They didn't, but on my theory it doesn't matter. And it's exclusive regardless of whether Muslims need minarets for their religious practice. They don't, but again, it doesn't matter. So when you interpret religion as culture, in the way I have today, as a third-person mode of social identity, it can really be as exclusive as a theological religion. And this, I think, is what is wrong with recent cases of symbolic neo-establishment in Europe.
Thank you very much.